Webinar devoted to bridging the digital divide in the time of COVID-19. My name is Dr. Jennifer Putney, and I'm an associate professor at the Simmons University School of Social Work. I'm also the director of our Center for Innovation in Behavioral Health Education and Research. It is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight. And I just want to, before we get started, go over a few housekeeping items. The first is that this session is being recorded and it will be emailed out to all participants afterwards. The second is that if you are collecting CEUs, you received an email with a link to the Zoom meeting, and that included a sign-in link to a sign-in survey. So if you could just make sure that you are signing in using that form. Again, that's only if you're collecting CEUs. And then at the end of the webinar, you'll also receive an email with a link to the satisfaction survey and also the sign out. So please just check your email and inboxes for that. Please note that the chat function is disabled for this webinar. So if you do have some questions, please hold those till the end during the Q&A session. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email cyber@simmons.edu. This webinar series is an initiative put forth by the Center for Innovation in Behavioral Health Education and Research at Simmons University, otherwise known as CYBER, which is a hub of innovation and training and research in healthcare and technology and in substance use that aims to serve urban and rural communities by increasing access to high quality, evidence-informed care. Today's webinar represents a really important area of focus for the center, which is looking at the intersection of racial justice, technology, and clinical social work practice. It is my pleasure and my privilege to welcome Dr. Daren Graves and Mike Langlois as presenters this evening. I will introduce Mike, and then he will introduce Daren and also this evening's topic. Mike Langlois has over 25 years of experience in counseling adults and families. He started working in public schools and clinical settings to advance the access of students with differing abilities and learning challenges. His work includes treating patients who use video games from a gamer affirmative stance, and his theoretical background combines psychodynamic theory, contemporary cognitive and learning theory with cutting edge technologies. So again, I'd like to extend my heartfelt welcome to our presenters this evening, and I will now pass it off to Mike.
Thanks, Jennifer. Good evening. I'm Mike Langlois. Thanks for joining us for the third segment in our year-long cyber series on racial justice and emerging technologies in social work practice. This academic year, we've been looking at how race in the U.S. impacts education, health, and behavioral disparities, and how emerging technologies can widen or narrow these disparities. Tonight, we're going to focus in on education, how the COVID pandemic has impacted us and exacerbated already existing disparities in technology and learning. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, nearly 93% of households with school-aged children reported some form of distance learning during COVID-19 this past year. But this large number belies some important differences within it. Households with income less than $50,000 were significantly more likely to have paper materials sent home rather than engage in online learning. This is not surprising given what we have known long before COVID, namely that Black and Latinx households were 10% less likely to have computers and internet subscriptions in their home. More heavily reliant on smartphones and limited data usage, how have these disparities played out in a time we relied on technology more for education than ever? These digital divides impact Black and Brown learners differently depending on their developmental stage, and more on that in a minute. But first I want to introduce you to my discussant, Dr. Daren Graves. Dr. Graves is an associate professor of education and social work at Simmons University and adjunct lecturer of education at Harvard Graduate School of Education. His research lies at the intersection of critical theory, racial identity development, and teacher education. Dr. Graves has reported on his work in a variety of publications, including Schooling for Critical Consciousness, Engaging Black and Latinx Youth in Analyzing, Navigating, and Challenging Racial Injustice, from Harvard Educational Press 2020. He also co-teaches critical race theory in education at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Graves also serves as co-chair of the ERA Hip-Hop Theories, Praxis, and Pedagogy's Special Interest Group. Dr. Graves, thanks for joining me tonight for this talk.
Very happy to be here.
So maybe the best place to start is a definition. Can you tell me what your conception of the digital divide is? What is the digital divide, and what's its relevance to social justice and social work?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, so digital divide, I think refers to a variety of conditions that gives people basically differential access to either access to getting information through information technology, or to disseminate information out through it, right? And so that, I think that manifests itself in a few different ways. I mean, the most obvious way to think about it is things like access to technology, right? So do you have a broadband modem or a modem at all, right? Or do you have a computer or a phone, to be able to, access, things like the internet? So that's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is what kind of even if you do have the technology, right, like the physical things, like what quality of technology do you have, right? And so a lot of us, right, as we've been, relying on Zoom, for example, for so many things, right, we have seen how even, those of us who have, access to pretty powerful broadband, internet, right, that we may not be even trying to share with other people in our household, right? Even under these conditions, right, we're seeing our internet capabilities being sort of stretched to the limit, right? And so you can imagine, what that looks like if, if your access to internet comes through, for example, let's say, your cell phone plan is instead of, let's say, someone like myself who gets it through, some big broadband company, right? In the ways in which, that's going to really limit, yes, you have access to internet, but it's limited compared to someone who has, a broadband modem, right? That's another way to think about the divide. Another way to think about the divide too, in terms of, and I'm thinking about my, students in particular, right, is, so, and this is another one that we've all been kind of navigating, and, is time and space, right? So in other words, right, like, most of us have tried to curate a space in our houses or our offices or wherever, right, where we can, utilize the technology, talk to each other like this, listen, be taught, etc., right? And for many students, and I'm talking about both I'm talking about graduate students, college students, K-12 students, just having, a space, where there's not a lot of noise in the background or activity or, things like that, to be able to, engage in learning that way. Oftentimes, many of, I talked about sharing access, right? So what happens if you're in, a smaller apartment, and then you have 3-4 other people, siblings, family members, et cetera, who will all need to be using the internet at the same time, right? That's going to put a strain on things, right? And so I think, and I could think maybe of a few more, but I think the point is that there's a variety of things that both have to do with like actual access to technology, right? And then also about access to time and space to take advantage of the technology that speaks to the kinds of differential either access to the information technology or the ability to like take advantage of it.
Yeah, I think those are really great ways to get us started in this. And I was actually thinking about this in terms of privilege not too long ago, because I think a lot of us that are subscribed to Xfinity and Comcast got a taste of our privilege being taken away this year when it was announced that there was going to be a cap on our data and that we were going to have to pay more. Now, imagine if you are a family on a family plan that only has your smartphone and has been only be able to use data all along. And I think your other point in terms of living situations is really pertinent for social workers. I don't know about you all, but I have at least one spouse and 3 family pets that are hiding in a room somewhere so that I can do this. And that's because I've got the privilege of having multiple rooms. But so many of our patients and clients live in studios or in substandard in terms of rooms, housing, and this does disproportionately affect Black and Brown Americans. So I think that you're right to point out the digital divide is both in terms of physical space and in terms of technology, in terms of bandwidth.
Could I add something to that too? Because I'm thinking about, clinicians as well, and I was thinking about privacy, right? And we in this time, this time where we're doing so much telemedicine, right, to be able to do this, right? It's, again, I was thinking about when you're talking about the privilege of having space, right? So when I have a chance to speak with my therapist, I can cultivate a space where, like, I can get my headphones on, I can go in a room, right? There's a lot of places that may not be the case, right? So I've people who are going outside, going in their cars, to go, walking around the block as the only ways that they can find time and space to get the privacy to do things like, especially clinical work as well, so that you made me that made me think of that as well.
That's a great point. And the other thing I think some people are probably going to relate to here, who may suddenly have their children at home or their teenagers at home learning, is there's been a loss of space that you used to be able to distance yourself from your child's education. But the expectation that this change in space has been is not just that your kids are on Zoom, but that you're going to be doing more work and more of the instruction. And, for a lot of families, especially disproportionately people of color who have been essential workers all along, that are not home, this creates a kind of a double bind, because not only is there a limit of technology, but they've had put upon them this extra expectation that, well, of course you're home with the kiddo at the tiny room table, of course you can help out with the teaching.
Yeah, and so yes, right, and I think we've all been feeling that in some ways, right? But yes, I think our most marginalized communities have been feeling it the hardest, right? And that I've definitely felt the privilege of thinking about my ability to be able to work remotely, stay home, work from here, and all the benefits that can come with me being able to be in proximity, right, to my children as they're getting educated, right? We've all either experienced or heard the stories of us kind of like leaning over, kind of peeking over our students' shoulders as we're trying to hear what's going on, and then be able to support them. Yeah, I mean, the other part of this too that's even that exacerbates it even more is the point that, like, a lot of the work that's happening remotely, especially in schools, on computers, requires some measure of technology, some measure of sort of technology, knowledge, right? Whether it's either, especially if it's just a specific softwares or specific websites, right? That, right. Those of us with privilege may have some issues trying to just figure out and help the young folks that way, right? And then so imagine if English is not your first language, or you may not have, for a variety of good reasons, you haven't had a lot of access to how to navigate some of these sites or Google Suite types of software and packages that people are using. That's not now, in addition to maybe some of the challenges that parents are going to have in supporting their students under normal circumstances. Now we have a whole nother layer of learning, right, that has to go on in order for them to be able to help their students successfully navigate just just showing their learning, right, via the technology that we're asking, we're sort of leaning on, if not relying on, at this point.
Right, and not just students, teachers. And here's where I have long assessed and long maintained that technology hits on class issues all the time. That we put the tech guy in the basement as a sign of a devaluation of what technology means until we suddenly need it. And some of the schools that are predominantly Black or Latinx and are most hit by budgetary constraints also have teachers that have had less access to technology, less access to education on it. And so now you have not only kids struggling to learn the technology, but teachers struggling to learn a technology that they never had to rely on before.
Oh, you've hit, I mean, wow. Yeah. I mean, it's, teachers, I've been feeling and in honoring the work that teachers have been doing for this, this whole time, because it's been hard enough even before the pandemic, and now, right, it's everything, right? And so there's a huge learning curve, I think, for many teachers in general, trying to make any of this stuff translate into this virtual space. But and to your point, yes, and so there's been a lot of learning, I mean, a lot of learning that teachers have had to do in order to like figure out this software, make it accessible to their young folks, right? Scaffold learning through these, different platforms, but also make it even more dire than that. I mean, I know teachers for whom remember we were talking about the young folks' access to technology. I'm talking about the teachers' access to technology. So I know many teachers in Boston public schools who live in buildings where, for a variety of reasons, they either had no access or limited access or spotty or just not good access to broadband internet, right? And which is, puts the whole class in a bind, right? So if your second grade teacher, for whatever good reasons, can't get anything resembling, reasonable access to the internet, now the whole thing is out of whack, right? And we know that Boston public schools, other schools across the country have really, really been leaning on the technology to make this work, right? Like making sure that, trying to like make sure that all students have Chromebooks, blah, 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 blah. But if, what does that mean if the teacher either doesn't have access to the internet or or worse, doesn't know how to teach through the technology? And by the way, I'm not blaming any of the teachers who are, struggling with that process, because there's been zero formal training, anything to really make that happen. It's really been like, hey, usually it's been something like it's been a mess for everybody. So I'm not trying to lay the blame at anybody in particular's feet, but usually the district will say, hey, we're using this, figure it out, get ready, because we're going to be using it next week. Right?
Yeah.
That's a lot.
So, here is one of the things that we, do want to go back to the politics of school systems, that school systems in our country have a very weird setup for funding. It's a bit of federal funding, but it's largely based on property taxes, which means that for multiple reasons, parents are really strong advocates. And what I've seen happening with several school systems is administrators get caught in this bind of parental pressure to open up schools. And they've also got teachers unions saying, no, we're not safe yet. And where this comes down in terms of the technology is because that no one is willing to set a limit and say, look, I know you're all going to be a little mad at me, but we're not going back to school for 3 months. It's always maybe next week or maybe in 2 weeks. There's never a proactive way technology can get rolled out or implemented. It's always reactionary. And so what happens is everyone suffers more because nobody actually set a limit. And we know from, working with kids that limits are useful. And so I mention this partly because if we do have a resurgence, I'm hoping someone out there will listen to me and actually call it and put a much longer but specific amount of time and energy into creating a technology plan.
Yeah, and what I appreciate about your perspective, Mike, here is like, this is, there's been so much talk, right, about, how this moment, right, this sort of, pandemic moment, if this is not the time, right, to reimagine what schooling should be than when, right? Like, you know, this has been one of those things where it's sort of, we've been compelled, right? And I think, you know, for me, you know, even before pandemic, I felt like, you know, schooling writ large has been kind of lagging in terms of its functionality. So what do I mean by that, right? Like, in a lot of ways, the way that schools are set up now, they're still set up to prepare people. It's basically running on a 19th century schedule to prepare people for 20th century jobs, right? I.e. jobs that don't exist anymore, right? And so I think we've been long overdue as our economy has shifted from, you know, this manufacturing based economy into this information economy. We're sort of long overdue for making school, even if we're just imagining a school at, you know, we always hear this mantra, school, you know, the jobs of the jobs in the next 50 years haven't been invented yet, right? And so that sort of places a bind on like, well, what does that mean for what schools should be if we're thinking of schools as preparing people for those jobs? So long and short of it is, we were overdue before a pandemic for reimagining what schools should look like. Even if we're thinking of, you know, the Googles and the Amazons as like the archetypes for the jobs of the future, like what, you know, what we're doing right now is not preparing students for those jobs, if that's what we think, right? The pandemic moment, even more so, is making this, right, is making this urgency to reimagine schools happen, right? And so for me, the way that translates into the use of technology is, you know, I have a lot of parents who've been very worried about their, and I understand it, their children's schooling over this last year and a half, right? They're like, you know, this is not what we imagined. Like, are my students losing track? Like, are they falling behind? My sense is probably not. You know, my sense is that, you know, young folks are extremely resilient and are learning, you know, lots of different things in lots of different ways, right? So maybe they're not learning the exact things that are on the scope and sequence of whatever antiquated curriculum that's out there for, you know, our right? But but they're learning a lot of other things, right? And so my point is like, what, you know, and my point is, I guess my point is thinking about, let's say we all got the vaccine tomorrow and everything was just like gone, right? There is no way that school should look like what it did the day before, you know, we all locked down. There's no way, right? And so this is the time to really step back and I have parents actually think about this, and I think we need to do this as educators and clinicians, to really step back and think about, like, if we got rid of all these like written out standards for learning, and right, like, how will we know that school, like, what is school for? How do we know that it's working for our young folks? Right? And does that make sense? Does that make sense?
No, well, I've often said school should be more like a video game. Instead of getting grades, you should unlock levels and move on to the next piece of learning. And to your point, you know, I've heard from some of my parents and their families, they're actually doing better with education with COVID. And here's the dirty little secret I want to let out. They find it easier to focus. They've had a reduction in stress because they're not having to conform to this industrial model of education or bullying. And so what this tells us is that we were failing some of these kids grievously before this pandemic. And if they can be succeeding now, then what can we bring back to learning with a post-COVID school?
I love this question. It's a great question. And so I think this, you're right. Some of the students, there are students who actually are thriving, and many students of color, by the way, are thriving under this sort of regime we're under. And I think a part of it is because, right, like, we really, and this is sort of what I was alluding to before, we've really sort of, there's lots of parts of the school day that are, let me just put it bluntly, wasted time, and that are very subjective and contribute to teachers sort of coming down with, like, you know, just problematic notions of what their students can do or cannot do, right? And so this model where we've had to really, like, pare down, like, okay, like, let's focus on, you know, what we need to learn and what we need to be teaching, because we don't have a lot of wasted time here, right? Has really, I think, both, like, streamline the teaching and learning process so that, you know, that's really benefited the students who are you know, who basically need the, you know, you need to be benefiting from the most, right? And I think it sort of cut down on some of the ways in which and not totally, let's be honest, but some of the ways in which when we're in person, we evaluate our students based on things that have nothing to do with their cognitive, ability, right? And so I think my sense is that we should be learning, and I'll give you another way of thinking about it too. My own classes, I've had to convert a lot of my college classes into online classes, and as soon as we go back to full on ground, I guarantee you my classes are a lot of my classes are going to be remaining hybrid, right? And it's because I figured out that like I can actually get more learning, more direct and intentional learning out of my students by and sort of thinking of the ways that I've organized my class in this sort of hybrid space than me just kind of showing up. I'm just gonna be honest with you. Than me just kind of showing up to class, my 3-hour class, and I know I have this general sense of what I want to do, and it's kind of like jazz, and I kind of like get through it. But when the ways in which organizing classes for a hybrid space or online space really makes you think as the teacher, right? Very hard about what are my learning objectives for today? Like, what am I giving them before they show up to this live session to really make sure that they can hit the ground running? And so I think the course design perspective and the curriculum design perspective when we're moving into the online space is super exciting to me, because it really makes you as the teacher be super intentional about everything that you're doing, and that can only benefit your students along the way.
Yeah, I'm a whim winger when it comes to instructional design too, and hybrids definitely. I had that experience, but I want to go back to something else that you were actually being very diplomatic about, and I'm not going to be diplomatic about, and it's basically two reasons we should be turning off our cameras when we're doing Zoom classes for our students. So we need to get honest first off that we're using the cameras for less for attachment and more for surveillance. But here's the problem. We have got emerging neurological evidence that watching you speak and trying to match up your lips to the sound is taxing my brain more. And that's what that Zoom fatigue is we're all feeling. But here's the second thing. If you turn off all the cameras, you may just be turning off some implicit bias as well. We know that boys are more likely to be called on for mathematics than girls. We have research on that. We know that children that are Black or Latino are more likely to be diagnosed with learning disabilities and receive services earlier. Some of this is about implicit bias, and these cameras actually could go off. And in fact, we might find that people are less fatigued and also less the object of implicit bias.
Agreed, and I think I think another aspect that I think comes with that, with this online teaching environment is giving. I think it should be, and I think many educators and a lot of us are using this. It's just giving folks multiple ways to participate, right? And so I think there's lots of good reasons, like where for students to have their cameras off, maybe not be able to, I'll do class, what question to the class, what do y'all think? And then you get, you'll get, usually to your point, Mike, this, students with specific types of privilege will usually feel comfortable speaking up, right? Those who don't will, remain silent, and so what have I been doing? I've been using things like Google Jamboard or simply in a Zoom, the chat space or a shared doc or whatever, right? Some other way, right? For folks, private, if you have any questions, send me a private chat in the Zoom, whatever, right? Just a whole bunch of different ways to both let folks display what they're learning, right? And also just capture it and hold on to it too. I'm a big fan of I'm not trying to put any, I'm not trying to advertise any specific things, but I think things like Google Jamboard or just creating or any sort of shared documents or note catchers, I think are wonderfully equitable types of tools, because they both give people multiple different ways of kind of, participating. And then you can just catch all those ideas and hold them. And students who need to process those things and come back to them and think on them, it's there for them, right? In ways that when we just sit there and have this conversation in a class, and then and then it just goes away, right?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think one thing that you haven't mentioned, and I don't have stock in them, so I'm not doing a plug, but TikTok is a perfect thing for especially kids that, as we know, are 10% more likely to be relying on smartphones at home for technology. Take a video of that cooking assignment. Take a video of your answer. And by the way, it's good practice to learn how, for some of us, to be succinct in 60 seconds or less.
I'm glad you mentioned this. Yes, yes. I mean, there's so many, whether it's in the education space or the clinical space, there's so many great opportunities that because we have the technology at our finger, right? The technology is such a double-edged sword, right? Right. TikTok is such a double-edged sword, right? But you're right. There's so, it gives, it's funny because I teach a lot of writing classes in college, and I've been moving, like, in all my writing classes, like I've been making at least one of my major assignments like not like a paper, like something, something in the media space, an Instagram story, a Twitter thread, something, right? Because you're right, that's, by the way, you mentioned TikTok, and I have a 16-year-old daughter, man. My daughter learns more on TikTok than anything. I'm telling you, than anything. Yeah. I'm not, and for better and for worse, for better and for worse. So I'm and so I'm deeply interested in these spaces like TikTok, right, and Instagram and other places. I know some of us are just like, what is that, or why would you even think about, right? You'd be blown away, both positively and otherwise, right, about the types of different information, narratives, understandings that young folks are getting, that are producing through TikTok. And so last thing I'll say real quick is that, and I'm sure we'll get to this more, is just thinking of these thinking about both we often think about social media and these other things as, the young folks or the people as consumers, right, of these things, but we should also be thinking of them as producers, right? There's a lot of potential there.
So, all right. So I'm going to tell you my TikTok story because it's totally relevant to what we're talking about. I have a professional TikTok account. And one of the things that happens if you get enough followers is you can do lives. And so about 2 or 3 months ago, I'd started doing lives, and I said, I am a therapist. I'm not going to be doing therapy on TikTok because, to me, that doesn't work. But I am also a human being, and I'm happy to talk with you a little bit about my experience. And I would get people coming to my lives. And one night we had this young guy who was probably 12 or 13 years old. And he started texting on one of my lives and saying, I'm really scared because I have to go to court. Turns out he had been a straight A student, but when COVID hit, he had stayed home and he just couldn't manage the technology. And so the school had for some reason, decided to refer him for, I guess, what was the equivalent of a chins. He was terrified. And so using TikTok, I was actually able to say to him, this sort of court isn't the same as court that you see on TV. And what I would encourage you to say when you go to see the judge is that you really were a straight A student and you want to be one again. You want some help from the school social worker. You want some help from the assistant principal, that you want to know what your resources are to help you, because he was living with a single mom and she just could not do work and manage his education. So all of this good social worky stuff is actually happening on TikTok, on a live. And so I really do think that social workers would benefit from learning about these sorts of things, because this kid actually left that 5 to 10 minute chat much less anxious and actually prepped to advocate for himself.
Yeah, so I hear three things about, things like, sort of things like TikTok in terms of why we should be engaging with it, right? One is like meeting folks where they're at, right? That's a place where you're gonna find them and they're gonna, you'll be able to interact with them in that space, right? I think the second one is like, whether we like it or not, like there's a lot that folks are getting lots of information off of TikTok, right? And so at the very least, right, it'll give us a sense of like what kinds of things that young folks are understanding. But there's lots of amazing critique and social analysis that young folks are doing. So that's the third thing I want to mention. Like, if you look at in these space, and yes, there's so much. I mean, there's, as in every social media space, there's like lots of nonsense. So let's just put that aside, right? But like, if you look at it with the right eyes, you can see young folks engaged in the types of dispositions, right, that we are really interested in, like them analyzing, social systems and complex things. And then here's the part that excites me about it is that then if they're excited, if they're savvy with the technology and they want to do something with it, then you can start to push them. Like the TikTok and the other space can be a realm of agency and action, right?
Yep,
So
yep.
now, like, they can start to feel like, when they learn things that they want other folks to understand, whether it's their community or their peers, their whatever. Now they can start to, and this is what I mean about the production piece. Now they can use that space because they know that they have a captive audience there to start to like spread information and do action out there. I mean, one of the most I think well publicized forms of TikTok activism that I can think of most recently was during the last presidential election, and many young folks on TikTok organized to buy tickets to, what was it, one of I think Trump's
rallies, yeah.
one of his rallies, and so they all bought them, and then but with zero intention of showing up. And then created this, and then sort of created this, political space where that was all done through TikTok.
Right.
All done through TikTok.
So, we're talking about, I think, a mutual sweet spot, which is adolescents and early adopters. And we're also kind of going Brave New World a little bit early. I want us to shift gear and go back because I want us to talk about the kids I'm most worried about developmentally, and that's preschool aged kids. In our country where universal preschool is not a given, many of our youngest learners are attending school and receiving so that they can receive additional supports like speech and occupational therapy. Some of these kids have now spent about a third of their lives not having access to facial cues outside of the family and without having direct instruction crucial to their development. If you want to reassure me of this, I would love to be reassured, but I'm worried about that particular subset specifically.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, I think there's a lot to be concerned about. And I think, I'm less concerned, in a weird way, I'm less concerned about, I'm concerned about their development, right? But I think my concern about their development is a function of, and it makes sense, our inability at this point as adults, right, to give them what we think they need at this point, given our constraints, right? And so, in other words, we have, one of the things that COVID has, basically shown us is that, school for us, as much as we like to, I don't know, think of it in these loftier terms, let's just be real. One of the primary functions of school is babysitting, right? And that's one of the big pushes to get the schools right back, because like if we're not babysitting, then people can't go to work, right? And then that whole thing, right? But all that to say is that, I think young folks are extremely resilient. So while I'm concerned, I think ultimately I think they'll be okay, and I think they'll, they're going to be functions, right? This is why we're concerned. They're a function of the context that they're developing in. But yes, I do think, from the research that we know on young folks and the ways in which, basically in the 21st century that, we've been in the United States, right, that we've been trying to healthily socialize our young folks, right? Plopping them in front of screens for hours on end is just not, it is the farthest from what we really want to do, right? Yes, there's great research that shows, in targeted and limited ways, that have, even in this context where, yes, young folks are going to have to develop, competencies around using computer, that whole thing, right? That for sure. But it is developmentally detrimental for young folks' interactions with other folks, with it becoming the only or the sole means of like learning, information. It's not good, right? And I think that's why, the CDC and others, right, that's why the priorities around getting folks back to school have been folks with developmental delays, right? And young folks and folks who we just know developmentally need to be in person, learning, dealing with, social cues that you cannot just read or react to or, understand, right? When you're doing a Zoom call constantly, right? And so there's, especially I'm thinking, particularly in the realm of social emotional development, there's so much work emotionally, especially at the young, and the thing that's so exciting is that I love about your question is that age, that early childhood age, they learn so much. The young folks are sponges. They're learning language. They're learning emotions. They're learning social norms, right? And this is not, the ideal environment for them to be doing that. There's so much that needs to be sorted out by being in the same space with other people, right? And so yes, they're getting a lot of that with whoever they're with at home, and that's great. And in the world we're trying to socialize young folks into, for the most part, we're trying to get them to be socialized with folks, yes, within their family, but in circles of, context for, moving further and further away from their family. And that's just really hard to do right now. So this is not it for our early childhood folks at all. Tactile learning, there's, imaginative play. There's so much. There's so much.
I think the only thing I would add, and maybe kibbutz a little, is I deal with a lot of parents that are really going on about screen time. And we often tend to blame or demonize technology. And not all screens are the same. And this is one of the reasons why the Pediatric Association of America, with its really strict rules about restricting access to everything, drives me crazy. Kids playing with switches where they're moving around, kids that are doing Dance Dance Revolution, anything that evokes what we would call a illusory attitude, a play state, actually makes for better learning. So I would just encourage folks, it's not about video games and Netflix are the same. And certainly, I think moderation in all things, it could be a good motto. But I'm really, I'm reluctant, given what you just said. This is the shape of the time right now. Your kids are going to be playing on the Switch more, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, as long as they're playing, not kind of involved in a different screen experience, which is more passive.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And that's 100% right. Like, it's not just the screen, it's what they're doing. And I think why this is why most parents, I think, are worried about screen time, is because, when the screen becomes babysitter, right. That's when, that's why right. As opposed to, if you're really like you're saying, curating an experience for them, you don't have to be like involved in the exact like activity with them, but are like interacting with them around the activities that they're doing. Yes, then so yes, just being in front of the screen doesn't like melt your brain. It melts your brain when you're, like you said, when you're in a passive state, right? And I mean,
we could probably talk a little bit about the many learning objectives embedded in Animal Crossing, but rather than do that, I'm just going to tease us about that. I want us to talk about other developmental phases. I guess I'm wondering, in some ways I think adolescence, but I wonder for you, who do you think is most vulnerable during this particular pandemic in terms of remote learning?
Yeah, in terms of developmental stage, I think I'm with you in terms of adolescence. I'm thinking about because there's a lot of different things. I mean, one, the our adolescents are very for a lot of good reasons are very much, for the most part, craving social interaction, if that's not their primary function in some ways, right? So I think there are ways in which, and by the way, as our adolescents are evolving to the point where like they don't necessarily need to be in the same space for them to be happy with their interactions. But on the other hand, I think a lot of them, I think adolescence is a time where we basically constructed it as a time for young folks to like figure out who they're going to be when they become an adult, right? And so in that way, I think we have, organized life for adolescents to sort of go out into the world, interact with people, figure out how to like, be in the world without someone like always standing over your shoulder and telling you what to do. But I also think, and with this increased social time is a lot of, fraught, ways of being, right? That can involve bullying at worst, maybe lots of disinformation, right? About important things like sex and sexuality and identity and, we get mad. We're as adults, we're concerned about the disinformation when it comes to our democracy and things like that. But there's all types of information out there that young folks, for better and for worse. My daughter tells me all the time, "Oh, I learned it on TikTok," right? And that's great sometimes, and that is bad sometimes, right? And so, and I think that it's also a time where adolescents tend to be very I don't want to paint with too broad strokes, but can be, they're in some ways very akin to some ways to like 2-year-olds. They're very black and white and not flexible in terms of their thinking sometimes, right? And so when you get into that, that leads to like, all the things that we typically associate, the risk-taking behaviors and the things that we associate, right, with adolescents. So I think in this space where and one more important feature, right? The sometimes like by definition opposition to adults, right? An adult, guidance. And so it is hard for adults to guide adolescents. It's hard to get when you are standing at a desk in front of that adolescent who is right there in front of you. It can be very hard to help guide that student, right? But at the very least, when that's you can see that student, they need help, they're not good at asking for help, and so you can orient yourself in their direction to help them start to engage in those help-seeking behaviors. Yeah. When the help-seeking behavior has to be like an email to your teacher or like a chat in the Zoom or like asking in front of a whole bunch of other students on a computer screen, like. So I'm just worried that like there are many, many adolescents who are struggling either academically, socially, emotionally, who under normal circumstances, it's hard to get them to like unearth any of that, much less position themselves to get help. But in this context, I'm really worried. And I'm seeing it happen both in that middle and high school level where we're like, to the point you're saying, students who like who were great before, who were fine before, like not showing up at all. I'm even seeing it in college. Same thing. Help-seeking behavior. Yeah.
I want to segue just for a sec to therapy stuff because I know we're supposed to talk about education, but I have to tell you, as someone that's been doing telehealth for over a decade, and as someone that's been doing video game-based play therapy with kids for years and years, so many of my colleagues were reluctant to get on to telehealth, and then suddenly when their livelihood was threatened because they couldn't meet people in person, suddenly they're willing to give it a try. And I have to tell you, I've had some pretty intense conversations while playing Call of Duty online, and I wish that more people would actually game with their patients. And in fact, one adolescent not too long ago was saying to me about his parents, he said, "They've given me a good life. I just need to be away from them for a bit." And I thought that was a really important summation of COVID and how it's really interrupted that individuation process for a lot of them.
And I appreciate the example because I think it speaks to just a general way, obviously really well in terms of connecting with young folks is right. You will, if it's especially adolescents, if it's going to be like, hey, okay, young person, we're going to sit down here and we're going to have a conversation about your emotions, right? It's over, right? It's done, right? And so the ways in which that you need to find the back door to these conversations through the front door is engaging with young folks in activities that they're enjoying, that they like, and that loosen them up and they get them comfortable, right? And then from there, and so I really appreciate that example, because now we, in this this age that we're doing everything, so remotely, we have some really good opportunities, right? Through TikTok, through games, right? Through other kinds of, spaces to engage young folks, right, around these issues. Can I just say something about that real quick? One of the, and I'll bring up TikTok again since we talked about it. I remember when I first learned what TikTok was, I was like, what is TikTok? And it's like, oh, it's just these little videos and people are like lip syncing. And I was just like, well, this sounds like nonsense, right? And so my initial reaction was like, I don't care about TikTok. I don't want to know. It just seems like a mess, right? But what I would say is that, like, I have found as a parent that when rather than being like, TikTok, what a mess, right? I'm like, I'll be like, what's going on TikTok, right? Show me something, like, tell me something, right? And that has been a window and a doorway to having so many meaningful conversations with my daughter that aren't, that end up being about really cool and profound, whether it's the election or identity politics or, cultural appropriation, like all these different things that if I was like, let's have a conversation about identity politics, she's just like literally sprint away. But when when we start having just like, what's going on TikTok? Show me what's happening, right? It's a nice, you're meeting them where they're at. You're and then you can go from there to engage in like those more meaningful conversations rather than the, okay, everyone, now we're building the time and space, right?
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
So, at about 7 o'clock, I was thinking we could open it up to general questions. But before we do that, I just want to go back and really kind of focus in on the racial disparities piece again, because I wonder what you might have noticed in your research as the most glaring racial disparities here, and what sort of solutions you're kind of thinking about this has pointed to.
Yeah. Well, see, what's been interesting. So, I've been sort of reporting out on this research that, me and my colleague Scott Sider at Boston College did. We basically were on back in 2012, right, when we were going through the previous iteration of these public conversations about police violence against Black folks, Black Lives Matter. Scott and I, both as developmental psychologists, both as educators, both as parents, were really interested in, what, if anything, schools were doing. There was a lot of talk about what parents were doing to help socialize young folks around this, but we were interested in, like, are schools doing anything to help young folks make sense of any of this, much less position them to do something about it, right? Mm-hmm. And so I bring that up to say is that I think one of the biggest disparities we have in education, especially around race, is to make schooling meaningful, right? To make it something that it's not alien or decontextualized to especially our young folks of color, right? And so I think our young folks navigate on their way to school, during school, on their way home from school, racism, like, all the time. And school becomes a place too often where we say, put all that stuff away. We're here to learn ABCs and 1, 2, 3s for ABCs and 1, 2, 3's sake, right? And to pass this test and to make sure we get annually, And meanwhile, there's all these like real issues, whether it's like relational issues that, young folks are having to deal with, whether it's like big structural issues, like, do I have why can't I get access to the internet while, during this pandemic, that we don't do enough of to help young folks like understand. And so in our research, what we documented were schools and educators that found a sweet spot of, because sometimes when we talk about this, sometimes people think, oh, it's either teach the ABCs or 1, 2, 3s, or teach this critical consciousness. I mean, by critical consciousness, I'm really talking about the ability to analyze and then take action against these major forces. And so we found a sweet spot where schools were teaching those core academic competencies that we're all associate with schooling as a means to help them both analyze a lot of the social forces shaping their lives, right? And then ultimately to help them take action against them. And whether that action could take the form of, doing things like, some schools would have like an action project that was like part of like their graduation requirements. Other students were doing more things that were school-based changes and things like that. But so I guess that's a long-winded way of saying schools, and in this moment, by the way, this is a really important moment where these, once again, right, between COVID, between, the Black Lives Matters issues and otherwise, right, all the issues we've been dealing with, I don't know, forever at this point, seems like, right? It's such, there's so much relevant, material to help young folks both understand and do something about. And again, I want to reiterate that there are ways that can and should be done, not as some separate project from we consider traditional schooling, but as a part of, and by the way, a lot in the research that that we did and others shows that students, especially students of color who have who have critical consciousness, are students who do better academically, psychosocially, like all the outcomes that we're really interested in young folks, like students who are prepared to understand like how racism works, and then to be able and then have the agency to do something about it. Those are the students who do best, right? And the reason that is by the way, and I want to just mention the importance of pairing the analysis with the agency and action, okay? Because I think sometimes people are concerned that when we teach young folks, first of all, some people worry, oh, should we be teaching young folks about this at all? And my answer to that is they know it, they learned it. And I'm talking about kindergartners, and they know it. And so that's out the door. But the point is that some people are worried that if we teach them about this, will they become hopeless or apathetic? And I would say they would if we only teach them about that there's racism. Okay, there's racism, kids. Okay, good night. That's all later, right? Yes, I would. That would breed hopelessness. Right. That needs to be paired with both like intellectual and other types of skills that can give them a sense that I can do something about this. And when you do that, that actually creates this concept that my colleague Dorinda Carter-Andrews calls achievement as resistance. So in other words, when you get students to that space, the resistance, rather than this notion that we often see with too many students of color, which is to sort of either be opt out or be pushed out, the resistance becomes to like not do school. In these cases, when you have critical consciousness, the resistance becomes to do it in the face of all the challenges in front of them. So I think that's kind of where I'm coming from.
That's a great analogy. And one I would add here is I want to talk about World of Warcraft for a sec. Because about a couple years ago, I taught a course where 20%, and this was social work students, so it was really fun to torture them. About 20% of their grade was they needed to level a character to level 20. They didn't have to write a paper on it. But one of the reasons that I think about this is that between the resurgent awareness in our culture about racial violence and the pandemic, kids are getting the idea that outside of home is not safe. And it's not entirely unrealistic. There is a lot outside of the world that's not safe. And one of the wonderful things about World of Warcraft as a play environment is you get thrown into a world that's not safe. And you learn that by gathering resources, cooperating with other people, there are different races and classes in the game. You learn how to become more empowered and how to progress into increasingly, and the world doesn't get less unsafe. You get more competent. And I think that, maybe we can open up to questions now, just on that note, that part of what education's goal always needs to be is to help kids get more competent. And we can't do that in a post-COVID and a racist society without actually helping them learn some of that efficacy you were talking about. Any thoughts before I open up to questions?
No, I often use, with young folks, I often use the video game analogy for why they should be listening to adults, right? Because I talk, because I tell them like, look, like the adults, like we did the, those levels that you're just now getting to in the video game, like we did them, right? And the young folks do this all the time. Young folks will go on like when I was a kid, it was like Nintendo Power magazine or something like that. You'd go on and you read like how to get past this, right? Now the kids are just watching, YouTube videos of people like going through the stages so to figure out how to do it themselves. And I'm telling them like the adults are like those YouTube videos. They're like, we did the stages, we know how to get through it, so you might want to listen to us a little something.
So if you're a parent, start a YouTube channel and actually video your lectures, because maybe then they'll actually, if you stream them with Minecraft in the background, they may actually listen to you. Our awesome producer Carly is hopefully going to open us up to questions now. And this is your time, people in the audience. We really want you to engage with the material. Please give us some of your thoughts and your comments and your questions. Oh, it's okay. We have a raised hand.
Yes, this is, my name is Amy Murphy, and I actually serve on a board of education. I'm calling from Georgia. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and I'm appreciative of all the things that you're bringing up. I wondered if you had any advice for advocacy, because my experience is so many of the lawmakers that are making these decisions really don't have a clue about what's happening in children's lives or the demands that we place on teachers, all of these things. How do we break through to get to that bigger picture that you're talking about really meeting children and what they need for the future?
Man, that's such a great question, and so much there. I mean, I'm not going to give you the best answer to your question, but I'm going to give you, but I think part of the context here, the problem is this de-professionalization of education, right? This notion that anybody who's been through school, right, can give you, can diagnose a problem with schooling and then give the solution, right? And so that's why I think there's many folks, politicians, and even more than politicians, the business community, that is driving what school looks like today. So the business community in particular has been a big pusher of these, the standardized testing movement and everything that's come with that, right? As a way to, keep pace with these other nations that we're trying to compete with, right? Economically. And it's really, and we're seeing the results of that, right? In terms of young folks, I've seen it as a college professor over the last, 12 years, just students are coming in with less and less skills to think critically, right? And so I think part of what I would do to help break the cycle is, we've been doing about 20 years of this kind of testing regime, and someone show me the results that it's working. Like, I just don't, it's not, someone show me that, right? So so I think a lot of the folks who push this stuff are really like results oriented folks. And I would say, like, okay, so show me the results, right? And they're not working, right? And I think this moment as well is making it abundantly clear, right? How important it is for us to be cultivating social and emotional skills for our young folks, right? No one do you hear anyone complaining about what my child's like standardized test score? Like, no one's like complaining. Everyone's like, everyone's like, I want my child to be out there, like, interacting with other people and adults and other children, and like, are they gonna, how are they gonna, right? This whole conversation we've been having, right? And so I think we're at a prime time where, and by the way, also, the increased scrutiny on bullying and other kinds of violence in society and in schools has also increased our focus on social emotional learning. So I think the confluence of the lack of evidence of how we've been doing things working, plus for a variety of reasons, the increased focus on the creating a more holistic approach to education, I think will help. And I think, by the way, politicians do have lots of concerns, but politicians also listen to their constituents, right? And when parents, we see this happening across the country. When parents want their kids to go to school, the kids are going to school. When parents don't want their kids to go to school, the kids aren't going to school. Like, that's what's going on, right? And so it's a really tough question. I hear you. There's so much work that needs to be done on, like, state and federal levels in terms of funding. There's a whole funding part of this as well. And I think we really have a system where we have a country where we spend way too little on education, right? That's the really biggest difference between the countries that we are competing with. It's not like these testing regimes. The testing regimes are a feature of those other countries that we go, oh, okay, well, in Japan and in Sweden and in the other places, they do these high stakes tests, and like, but in Japan and in Sweden and these other places, they spend like literally orders of magnitude more on their on their education than we do, right? And so a lot of it is we're trying to tinker with a highly under-resourced, system where people are fighting for scraps.
Thank you.
Amy, I want to give you an answer to that, basically focusing on the political, which is a lot of politicians are risk averse. And so I've got two words for you: pilot program. A lot of times you can, for example, if you want to do some sort of video game empowerment for school phobic kids, there's some research that shows that playing with a powerful avatar for 5 to 10 minutes, it causes an increase in self-confidence for up to 6 hours. If you want to slap up a Minecraft server or some other sort of video game server, you can do that very realistically, very cheaply. And a lot of times pilot programs like that are things a politician or a group of folks can get behind, because if it fails, well, it was a pilot. That's kind of what they're for. But if it succeeds, they get to really kind of showcase it. So I would encourage you to sort of, if you have any ideas, try to think of how to operationalize it as a pilot program, and you'll probably get some buy-in.
Awesome.
Last thing I'll say is that if you can tie any of the things that you want to do to, there's so much research that the things that we're interested in are actually are statistically like related to
Right.
the types of outcomes, even if it's test scores that they're interested in, that can help too.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thanks. That was a great question. Who else has a question? We love these questions. Please don't be shy. Questions, comments, you can argue with us. We're really very easygoing about all of it. Darren's like, yeah, come on, give us an argument. Are there experiences that you've had with either your patients, your students, or your kids that, you've kind of listened to us today and go, yeah, that's right on target? Or
there's
different?
one question, Mike, from Joanne.
Yep. Can you read it, or can she?
Joanne, you're still muted.
I'm curious about, in the age of disinformation, how we kind of think about how we address, and I want to say monitoring, because I don't like monitoring youth, but we have to figure out some way around that. How do you address that in terms of the whole, TikTok and all of the online work that we're doing?
I love the question, and I think it speaks to what I was talking to earlier about, creating schools for the 21st century, right? And so like one of a major skill that to your point, Joanne, that young folks need, is media literacy, or what I would call critical media literacy, right? And so that it really involves, engaging young folks in a process of getting them to think about how it is they evaluate information, right? And so, even with the TikToks, right? We talk to our daughter about like, okay, so is that enough? Is this enough information for you? Are you compelled by this? What if, what happens if somebody else puts some alternative information or a different TikTok, right? Or is TikTok, enough, right? Sometimes we'll have conversations with my child about, what's going to be a standard of information that will be enough for me to continue the conversation. And with our young folks, even more so, right? And so I think I think both, as an institution of education, as clinicians, as parents, we have to engage. And there's, lots of, it's an emerging field, critical media literacy. So there's more information out there, but there's a lot of intentional work that we have to do in that regard of giving young folks the tools. And by the way, let me just stop. Hold on. Let me just stop. We got to do this work. Hello. I'm talking about us adults. All right. Because I know a lot of us will be on our social media page, right? And, read a headline of somebody's, Facebook post and then be like, and then start commenting on it. Like, we haven't even read the thing. Like, one of the things that I wish we could do on like social media is like put like some sort of algorithm so that if someone has not read the article that I have posted, that they cannot comment on it yet, right? And so and by the way, so we have to read the articles, which we know many of us don't do. A lot of us have to evaluate the article, right? We as adults, we are in like a national crisis as adults, right? In terms of how to evaluate information. So let me just back up and say, we have lots of work to do in terms of critical media literacy. And then we may have some things to learn from our young folks, by the way, in terms of that, right? Because they, by the way, have been navigating this space for a while, and they are very, actually, in some ways, better than we are at starting to figure out, like, evaluating what types of information on their social media they should even be attending to in the first place. So I think it's a reciprocal teaching and learning process where we are helping each other, adults and young folks, become more information literate. And I would say, and UCLA is a great example of a school that where their School of Education and their School of Information Sciences are married. And I think we need more. What I would love, in reality, is a marriage between education, information sciences, and social work, because I think there's a nexus there that is right at the heart of your question, Joy.
So, I'm so glad you backed up there, Darren, because I was going to say the same thing, and I'm still echoing that. Today we had our director of the FBI basically debunking conspiracy theories that a large portion of our adult population still believes. And yes, I think kids are less enchanted with things on the internet, and may in fact be a little more skeptical. We do need to do critical thinking. And I would add, Darren, I don't think it's impossible if you advocate to Facebook for them to produce algorithms. I think it is totally realistic to have an algorithm that the person needs to have clicked the button and remained on that article a certain amount of time. So yes, you can do an algorithm, but again, as I remind parents I work with, there are no settings you can park your kids on. We can make some better algorithms, but the fact is we need to get down on their level and go, I'm not sure if Antifa was involved. Let's see what the research says. How would we go and find out doing it? And I think that's the hard part for parents often to do, is to sort of slow it down and walk kids through it without sounding like you're being patronizing. And what Darren just said, I think, is a really good inroad into that, which is to acknowledge we get things wrong all the time. So it's a great question, and it's really a call to action, I think, for all of us.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Just as an old youth worker, I would say we need to be having our youth training us.
Yeah.
Agreed.
Great question. Do not, if you have a question on your mind, do not be discouraged by the high quality of the previous questions. We want all of your questions. We only have 15 minutes left, and we really want to make good use of them. So what are some other thoughts people have? I don't know if anybody's hand is raised. I can't really see. Let's see. No.
Yeah, it looks like
Amitris.
Yeah, Amitris, sorry.
We have one question.
Okay. Hi. I'm still back on the TikTok, and I just wanted to say that I think that whatever is going to get and hold the attention is what we have to use. And we do know that TikTok is the trend. I'm a clinician, and there have been situations where I would address something that I've seen on TikTok in a group setting, and it automatically gets the conversation going, and they really are tuned into it. So if there was a way to really utilize TikTok as more than just the entertainment that the children use, there's a lot of Well, I know I got started on it because I was looking at the recipes and whatnot they have. But I just think it's a really good tool
Yep.
that the younger children really use. And we have to, we always want to say to the kids, this is where you need to go, this is what you need to do. But they have just as much to show us. And with that TikTok, there's just so much you can get off of TikTok.
Yep.
So much.
You can make a mean egg sandwich from watching TikTok.
Oh my God!
And let's talk about smartphones for a minute, because I've actually let kids bring their smartphones into my office for years, and I remember parents looking at me and saying, why are you letting them text or do something in there? And I was like, this has their undivided attention. You need to go through this to get their attention. And I think you're absolutely right. And kudos to you for doing that. And for TikTok, for a group, one of the things you might consider is between groups, have members of the group like one or two of their favorite TikToks. And then the beginning of each group, you share what are the favorite ones and why they like them. I don't know. Darren, what do you think?
That's a good idea.
And I very much like the notion, like you're saying, Mike, about discussing what it is that they like about it, because that just makes some really rich conversations, right? And about how they're making sense of the world, and getting them to really engage in some critical media literacy, by the way, too. You know what I mean? I very much appreciate that. What your comment also made me think about is when you read some of like the old historical literature about when like books started to become widely available, to like folks, the social commentary very much sounds like, the commentary on video games and technology. It's very much like, oh, these kids they're not gonna do any more imaginative play. They're just gonna have their nose stuck in a book all day. You know what I mean? So the way that we talk about video games and other things is the way that they talked about books, and most of the books, you know what I mean? So I appreciate the notion of like understanding yes, there's always pros and cons when new technologies come out, but I like the way that you're honing in on the things that are really drawing the young folks in through the technology. So I appreciate
that. Thank you.
No, thank you. Now we have 5 people raising their hands. Now, gosh, Darren, we're gonna have to get everybody in. Who's next?
Paul, do you want to unmute?
Hang in there, Paul. We'll wait for you. That tapping in the butt. Go ahead.
Sorry. It's my comment actually piggybacks on the last comment, and it was in response to your talk, Mike, somewhat. My son's a 4th grade teacher now, and he's struggling a lot with it. And one of the things the town that the school system that he teaches in does is they don't mandate students having to be videoed. The student can go off screen, and so kids are playing video games. He's suspicious. He knows they're playing video games, and so if he checks in with them every 20 minutes, and if they still don't respond, he figures they're gone. And my response to your comment, Mike, was maybe they're learning more because they're not in his class and doing a video game than attending his class, and maybe it's an opportunity for him to engage them in what they're playing and engage the class in what some of the video games are playing when they're supposed to be in class.
Yeah. But so you're that type of dad, huh? No, this is great. And let me take a stab at it before giving it to Darren. First off, there's a great TikTok teacher called Mr. Deary Teaches, who I believe is in Waltham, and he's a 3rd grade teacher, and he's got some funny TikToks that your son might relate to. One of the other interventions I've heard from teachers about participation is that teachers reward participation, not necessarily by seeing people on screen, but they'll check in with questions for each person, or they'll ask each person to do a random check-in during the class. And anybody that actually is there and participates gets to be in an Among Us game after class. And you can have up to 10 people in the Among Us game. So it's actually using a video game as a reward for attendance. So if he's got a class that's say 20 people, he'd probably have to do 2 Among Us games, but it's a way of making it less about surveillance and more about achievement and a reward. Darren, any thoughts?
I think that makes sense to me. And I think in general, like I've been doing this in general with Zoom classes, college students, grad students, whoever, this notion of like okay, sorry about that. It sounds like it's but I think the notion of like creating time in the class to turn off your camera, right? So like sometimes I'll be like, all right, we're gonna do like this. I'm gonna have y'all think of a question. Here's this question y'all need to do. And I'm gonna, we're gonna turn off our cameras for the next, I don't know, I do college students, so I'll say 8 minutes. So turn off your cameras, mute, do what you got to do. I'll see y'all in 8 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Like it does, So I don't know. Like maybe they use the entire 8 minutes to think. Maybe they use 2 of it to think, and they use the next 6 minutes to go on TikTok. I don't know, but So I think part of it is like, creating these, not trying to have student for a variety of reasons, biological, developmental, and otherwise, like not having folks the expectation that they're going to be actively doing the thing that I'm doing on the screen all the time doesn't make a lot of sense. And then I agree with the point of figuring out what it is that the young folks are really interested in and leveraging that, whether as either by having them share, building in times for folks to share these great things that they're doing on the side when they're supposed to be, I don't know, listening to you, or using the tech, using it as an incentive to, to like, okay, we're going to do some hard work and then you'll be able to do, 15 minutes on your Call of Duty game. Okay, go ahead. Right. That kind of thing. Or whatever it is you want to do for the next, that kind of thing.
Right. This is a great question. While we get our next question ready, Paul, the only other thing I would mention is giving teachers need to give students permission to close their eyes. That just to be able to say to a student, you know what, I know you may still be listening to me with your eyes closed, just as much as I know you may not be listening to me at all with your eyes open. Your eyes are not an indicator. You've had a long day of staring at screens. It's okay with me if you close your eyes. In fact, it's okay with me if you take this class while we walk. Well, that's my other big one. So anyway, next question.
Our blink rates go down by 50% when we're on screen. So if I think we normally blink like 16 to 18 times a minute, and it goes down by 50% when we're on screen.
Yeah, and it's real. It's real. Okay, so we had a bunch of them. We got a Devin's hand up, a Lynn's hand up, and Joanne may not have taken her hand down, but who?
Yeah,
Carly?
I can go.
Go ahead.
This is Devin. Sorry if you have already spoken about this, but I just had a couple of questions pertaining to the online format. Do you guys feel that the online format lowers the effects of social anxiety and like allows for increased participation in class? And then on the opposite end, do you guys feel that social development has changed in high schoolers as they like are unable to engage in social experiences and drama, so to speak? Or do you feel that do you think that those experiences they're missing out would teach valuable lessons, social lessons that they're missing out on?
Darren, do you want to go first or do you want me to?
You can go ahead. You
Right.
go first. Yeah.
First off, Devin, I assure you that there is still plenty of drama. As long as kids have access to texting, and Facebook, there will be plenty of drama. I do think in terms of the answer about social anxiety, it depends. I think a lot of the kids that I know that are school phobic or may have a hard time getting up in the morning, kind of as Darren alluded to earlier, we have our whole educational calendar backwards. Elementary school kids should be going to school at 7 o'clock and teenagers should be going to school at 9:30 or 10. That's how their neurology works. So depending on what's causing the kid to have a difficult time in terms of school, whether it be a school phobia or social anxiety, I've actually seen kids doing a lot better. I have a lot of kids that I work with, and they won't be offended if they hear me say this. I specialize with quirky kids, and they are less socially anxious. Now, this may this may mean we have some work coming up when things start to open up again. But I think that's part of why we were talking earlier about we need to identify now what really worked well during the pandemic for some of our kids and teenagers so that we can bring that forward. And if that means that we actually think about online cohorts or hybrid cohorts, I know that may be, anathema to some, but I'm all for it. So, Darren?
Yeah, no, I don't think I have much to add. I think for some students, this hybrid model has been actually good. Like, it's, I know some, including my own daughter, my oldest daughter, we've been homeschooling her forever. And and we've always been giving her the opportunity, especially as she's gotten older, to decide if she wanted to do it a different way. And it was actually once, and she's 11, in 11th grade she's 11th grader this year. This is the year that she decided to go back, tried to go to, the public high school. And it was because it was going to be hybrid / remote that I think facilitated her decision to go. But I think it depends. And I don't think it's the online. And I think it depends, right? And I'm telling you, and we've been talking about it, there are ways in which when you're doing this schooling thing online can provoke lots of anxiety for young folks, right? So some of it might be lost with some of the less interactions or drama, as you put it, but the ways in which the teachers are utilizing the space, or the student or the ways that the teachers are facilitating or not facilitating the space can cause more anxiety for folks. So I don't think it's the modality of the education. This is how it's being presented, and for the young folks to engage, right?
Well, I was just
and then how individual young folks make sense of it. So I think it depends. Yeah.
I was just thinking in a matter of when they raise their hands and they talk and participate in class, because now they're able to turn a camera off and they don't have all eyes on them, right? So then they feel more comfortable being able to speak their mind.
Yep.
I think maybe and maybe not. Yeah, it just depends on the individual. I think right. I know plenty of students who cameras off, everything, and the question goes out and they're still feeling like I am not going to be speaking up in front of this class, right? So it just depends, but it's a good question.
Right. And there are teachers that may not allow cameras to be off. So again, please go back to your teachers, advocate. I think we have time for one more question. Carly, can you be the arbiter of the last question?
Yeah. Lynn, do you want to unmute?
I just had a quick comment. What you all were already saying about rewarding the kids who are engaged. What we do, I'm in a 5th grade classroom, and at the end of the class, we'll have the kids, they get to pick what their reward is. And one that they love, that they always ask for, it's TikTok. You go on YouTube. They always tell me what to type in because I always forget. And I share my screen so you can see the TikTok video. Yep. But it's TikTok mashup clean version. And the kids get so excited. They jump up out of their chairs. They're all dancing. We'll have like 20 or 30 students on the screen, and they have the biggest smiles on their faces. It's so much fun.
And that's beautiful. And that's such a great, opportunity that is facilitated by the technology, right? That would be much harder that might be a little harder to get off, right? If we were just sitting there in the classroom by ourselves. Right. Doable, but more doable this way, right?
So that's great. So Lynn, what a wonderful way to kind of finish our talk off, because technically this makes you a TikTok creator.
And what was so great too is it was their idea.
Yeah, a lot of the best ideas come from our students, right? But thank you for meeting them where they're at. And if you didn't have a chance to get to us with your questions, you can get in touch with us through cyber. And now I'm gonna return you to our hostess with the mostest, Jen Putney.
All right, thank you, Mike. Thank you so much, Darren. Oh my goodness, both of you. This has been so much fun. I feel like I've learned so much, and I have so much to think about with respect to what education could be post-COVID. and what's the role of the social worker in helping to facilitate that? And like, there's just like, yeah, and how education and information technology and social work can all work together to not only imagine post-COVID education, but really make it happen. It's just so exciting, and I look forward to more conversations with you about this. So I'm here to thank you both, and also to wrap up and to remind people, for those of you who are getting CEUs, please look to your email for some links with respect to satisfaction survey and also a CEU sign out. Again, this the whole session has been recorded and will go out to participants. And if you have any follow-up questions for Darren, for Mike, feel free